All right, everybody. Welcome back to our multi-part series on development environments for Nautobot. Next up, we're going to be talking about a fun, interesting little concept of single sign-on. And one of the things that we always have to try and keep in mind with single sign-on is actually being able to sign on. And how can we set that up in a development environment? Because none of us want to have to worry about setting this up in production and it only being in production or anything from that standpoint. We want to be able to test things out in a local development environment. So as I get my last few things that are up and going, let's see. Here. I had to reboot so I can make sure that I did not run out of memory. Thank you, every Electron app that is running on my machine and all the 50 million tabs that I keep open like a heathen. All right. So to kind of start talking through where we're at and what we're doing, the correct directory. All right. So we have a local environment of KeyCloak. So KeyCloak is an SSO provider. We are using it just because it is a free solution that we can spin up a container to do our dev and test against. If you are using a SSO provider that is publicly available, so like if you're using Azure Active Directory or you're using GitHub or anything that is accessible from anywhere in your environment, that's not necessarily going to be an issue. This is where we're talking about where we are having our SSO provider and our Nautobot instance running on the same host, and where we may be running through some issues and what has to happen from that standpoint. The reason why that this is kind of a funny or a sticky situation to be in is both the backend Nautobot process, the Nautobot web server process, and the client have to have IP reachability to the SSO provider. That SSO provider, and when I say IP reachability, I can't just have one having a service pointing to east, one having a service pointing to west, and it work out. Because what happens is that the same authentication information that is used to pass to the client side for the redirect is the same information that is going to be used by the Nautobot server process to reach out to the actual system itself. So let's go ahead and get this party started. What we can see here is that I have a very simple Docker Compose file where I'm specifying a volume of KeyCloak Postgres data, mounting it in so to have some persistency there, setting up just some basic stuff with KeyCloak. I then have some basic information for the KeyCloak database to be able to map to this Postgres instance, how to get to it, how to log in, all of that fun stuff. And then I've got my default username and password that I'm using that I'm going to be exposing on quad 0 to port 8080. And we're just specifying that our KeyCloak service depends on our Postgres KeyCloak service. So let's real quick go ahead and do my export so I can have all the fun stuff that I need whenever I'm working with my Nautobot server instance. And just for grins, I'm just going to go back in here and do a, I think it's under, yeah, free shell, just so I can have my shell so we're good to go there. All right. What I need to do, I need to do Docker compose up -f, then specify my compose file, then up -d. All right, so now I should be good. Okay, I see I have my server Postgres KeyCloak and then server Postgres. All right, that's still not exactly what I needed. Bear with me for just one moment. There we go. Now we're cooking with fire. I was looking for my composed project name of live stream. So now I know I'm correct, sourcing from the correct environment variables. I have the correct Docker Compose file that I'm sourcing from. I now have my live stream Postgres and my live stream Keycloak. And if I do a Docker PS, we'll see that I have my Redis, my Postgres instance that we are using for Nautobot, and then I have my Keycloak instance and my Postgres instance for Keycloak that we'll be working with today. We're not currently running anything else inside of Docker that we're really caring about, and we do see that we're running Keycloak on port 8080. And so we wanted to do a Nautobot server, run server. If we come over here and we look for authentication backends, we're not seeing any authentication backends that are currently defined. So we can basically what we've done so far is that I've set up a generic Keycloak service. We're going to be stepping through and doing some configuration inside of Keycloak. So let's go ahead and grab that, run this over here. So do remember that I am running DNS using Route 53. So no big deal. Everything's running through Route 53, so I'm able to understand and know where to go for everything. This is just pointing back to my Ubuntu workstation that I have that I'm running Docker on. So here is Keycloak. We go to our administration console. We can come back over here, grab our username and password, so admin, and then our fun password. Go ahead and sign in. No, thank you. And we'll come over here. You'll see that we don't have, these are the out-of-the-box things that are already configured by Keycloak. And we don't see anything here for our Nautobot instance. So let's go ahead and let's start creating our information for our SSO client. And so these could be called, like for instance, I believe it's like GitHub, they're called developer apps or apps, if I remember correctly. Maybe a similar nomenclature to Azure AD. So we are going to specify our client ID of Nautobot. This could be foobar. It doesn't necessarily matter. This is something that we're going to be using later. So we'll go ahead and save that. We are going to need to change our access type from public to confidential. We'll get distracted for half a second from messages coming in. That's not a big deal. So now we need to specify our valid redirect URIs, or URLs, I should say. And so in our redirect URLs, what we're going to need to specify is our scheme. So we are using HTTP, so we're not using 443, we're just using, let me think that. Nope, we're going to use our Nautobot one. So we'll do HTTPS nautobot.whitej6.com /complete/keycloak /star. So what we're essentially doing is that we're saying this is going to be the valid redirect URL that we'll be consuming, and it's going to be complete Keycloak. And the reason why we're putting the star at the end is just in case there are any query params or anything that may be passed in. We want to make sure that we are accounting for those. And I believe this is all that I need to do for this very little tiny section right here. So we're good to go here. We're going to expand out our fine-grained OpenID Connect configuration. And inside of here, we are going to set our use assign info, our algorithm to RS256. These can be overwritten by passing in some additional variables into the plugin, into the Nautobot config file. But because this is a local development environment and we're wanting to keep it kind of lightweight and easy peasy, we're not going to be going through and doing any craziness there. Right, let's go ahead and save that. Saved. It was there the whole entire time. I didn't see it. All right. So this is all the configuration from the client for this portion just yet. So now we need to go in and create our mappers. So we'll go to mappers. We'll need to make sure that we add our built-ins of at least email, because that's what's going to be used to specify the, I mean, that's going to be the default that's going to be specifying for the, trying to think out, oh, what's this called? My mind is going blank. This is by default what's going to be used to associate the user inside of Nautobot itself. And then we do need to create a protocol mapper. Inside of the protocol mapper, we are going to be specifying the mapper type of audience, and then we are going to include our specific audience. So audience, include audience, and this is going to be the client that we had already specified. So whenever audience, there we go. Click save. So cool. So the audience is the client that we created, so not a bot. Cool. Now that we have these few items specified, we're going to need to go over to our Nautobot config file and start making some changes. I love how I close things out and I have lost all of my progress, which that's all right. That's not going to be a big deal. We will be able to get through this and have no issues. Maybe I didn't lose my stuff. Maybe I just wasn't looking at the correct screen. So we're good. So we're going to come over to our Nautobot config file, and we don't have our authentication backend specified. And just to make this easy, I'm just going to throw this at the end of file. No big deal here. And so we're going to do our authentication backends. Yep, that's the only place we have it. Cool. Just want to make sure I wasn't being a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puff. So let's see, our authentication backends. It's going to take in a list, and please stop auto completing for me. We're good on that. And so the very first item in our authentication backends that we need to specify is going to be the path to our social auth backend. This is very, 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 very critical, is that if you're doing SSO with Nautobot, and you're specifying your authentication backends, it is going to look for this specific one. It's if you cannot configure more than one authentication backend, it's going to look for this very first one for its SSO backend. The second item is expected to be the authentication object permissions backend. And if we take a look here, we'll see an example of some of these social core backends that are available. The social core project within Git has a tremendous amount of different backends that are readily available. I just wanted to, like I said, I just chose this one specifically since there was a local development container that I could run to be able to talk through where some of these issues may be. So the authentication backend that we're going to be using is going to be social core.backends.key cloak. Keep on trying to put an active C in there. Key cloak auth 2. If you're using SAML does require some additional library dependencies that OAuth and OIDC, and I believe OIDC may require some additional ones. I'd have to go back and reread the documentation, but I believe it does. And then from our authentication from our permission backend, we're just going to use the generic one of Nautobot for authentication dot object permission backend. Cool. So we've specified our authentication backends. Like I said, it's looking for index 0 to know what social auth backend to use. So if you're using Google Auth, you would specify that here. If you're using Azure AD, you'd specify that here. You would not specify your object permission first. You must first specify your social core backend first. So now, after that, we are going to go through and start specifying some of our underlying attributes for our social auth. So we need to do our social auth key cloak key. I could just type, that would make things even better. All right, so our key cloak key is going to be Nautobot. This is our client ID or client name that we had specified a second ago. Next item that we're going to need to specify is going to be our secret. And I'll show you where to go to grab that. And then now we're going to specify our URL patterns for our authorization URL and our access token URL. So this is going to be social auth key cloak authorization URL, and then our access token URL. So I've got a friendly little, and I'll throw this a little helper right here. So if you're using a key cloak and you're trying to follow along later with this example, what's it going to be is going to be base URL auth realms, then the specific realm that you are working with, and then protocol, and we're going to be working with OpenID connect, and then auth. And it's going to be the same thing, but token. And so if we go through, we look at that, what we are reaching our underlying service to is going to be HTTP Ubuntu server yj6.com 8080, and then we can just grab that, stick that there, and we can do the same thing here. And also, this is something that would be a lot better to be modularized, where that you're not having to worry about this is hard-coded and configured exactly in your underlying environment, especially if you're trying to keep your Nautobot config file as close to or as similar to your production environments as possible. This is where you would be using like an get env and pulling it from environment and loading it from an environment variable and using that to be how you can variabilize and configure things out. But since this is a demonstration on how you can do it in a local dev environment, just trying to keep it simple. So we are also going to need one more thing, which is going to be our public key. So I'm going to show you where we're going to go to grab those from KeyCloak. So public key. Like I mentioned, these are not real world. You would not be putting your public key or your secret into your configuration file in plain text. But because this is a local development environment and we're wanting to talk through things, we're doing it anyways. So if we come over to our admin console, see we have our Nautobot client, we go to credentials, we'll see our secret here. We can go ahead and grab that and come over here, drop that into our KeyCloak secret. And if we come back over here, and we take a look at our realm settings. So we're using a master realm. So we're just using the default master realm. If you were using something that was non-default, that's where you would change the specific realm that's referenced here. And oh, look at that. I did not change that. So let's quickly make that change so that I don't run into any issues. So cool, we got that. And then underneath our realm settings, general, we are going to need to grab a tiny tidbit of information, and this is going to come from settings keys. That makes total sense. Keys. Then we see our algorithm of RS256. So this is the specific algorithm that we're using. We'll click public key, and we will grab that here. Typically, if you're working with SSO in a production environment or in an enterprise, your client secret, your public key, and your client ID, and your URL patterns, those would be items that are provided to you typically by the team that manages the SSO provider, or if you're using a local instance of GitHub Enterprise or GitLab Enterprise, you should be able to do that yourself underneath your own user profile to configure that. So now if we save that, think we might be good. Let me go ahead and restart my Nautobot server process so that it'll pick up my latest changes into our Nautobot config file. Come over here, go to nautobot.whitej6.com, and I had signed in earlier, so let me go ahead and sign in. Client not found. You know what? I didn't spell Nautobot correctly. That would do it. So let's kind of talk through that. What happened here? So as soon as I hit the login button within Nautobot, it's not actually the login URL. It's going to be login keycloak, and it's going to look inside of the Nautobot configuration file for some very specific items that's going to be used in the authentication handshake. So one of the items that it's going to be using is going to be the client ID, and it's also going to be using the redirect URL. So remember earlier whenever we had specified our redirect URL and we added a wildcard to the end. So this is essentially a URL encoded string representation of our URL in our, right here, redirect URI, which is something that is not having to be configured because by you as the user, this is coming to you out of the box automatically by Nautobot. So you don't manually configure your redirect URI from Nautobot's perspective. Nautobot already knows that it's going to be sending it back to complete keycloak. Since we're using keycloak, if you were using Azure AD, it would be Azure AD would be within the redirect URI, and so on and so forth. The easy way to see those underlying I'm just going to the library itself. If you had a Social Auth Core, come here, we go to there, we go to our backends. This one go to keycloak, and we're using the keycloak Auth 2. And so what it's going to be looking for, and the way it's going to be made, is going to be using complete / and then the name attribute of the class we are using in our Social Auth backend. So since we're using the keycloak Auth 2, it's looking for the name attribute, which is keycloak. If we were using Google OpenID Connect, the redirect URL would be complete / Google-OpenID Connect /, and that's how the URL pattern is done. So let's see here. I've resolved that there. Let me stop my Nautobot instance, bring it back up, and we are going to come back here. We'll go to login, and then we'll see that we are getting an HTTP error. Not really expecting that, so it's saying I've got a missing parameter. What am I missing? Did I mistype something? That's typically half the battle with me. Missing error. So it's missing something getting passed to keycloak. I can tell it because I'm getting a redirect state invalid. My error is an invalid request. Missing parameter. Response type. Cool. Let's take a peek here. Let's make sure I didn't accidentally go through and mistype something. Give that another shot. All right, gotta love troubleshooting through these items. So I believe I probably missed a step. Let's kind of step through this. Let's see what I have missed. Look through my slide deck just to make sure everything looks good. I got my client ID, which is Nautobot. I've got my access type set to confidential. I've set my redirect URL as expected. Inside of my fine-grained OpenID Connect, I've got my user info and my request object set to RS-256. Under credentials, that looks right. Yeah, that's the same. I think it may, let's go check on our mappers. I'm just going to delete this just in case. I don't know if I actually need that. I don't have that in my notes. All right, include audience Nautobot. Ah, I see what happened. Click client scopes. This just worked. I know it did. You know what? Not a big deal. We can recreate this, and that'll be all fine and dandy. So let's go through this, and I'll step from the beginning, because I'm sure as heck that I probably made a mistake along the way. So I've got our client ID, which is going to be our key, is Nautobot. Go ahead and save that. we are going to require confidential as our access type. I can go ahead and grab for our redirect URL and then do a wildcard at the end. Fine grain, we come down here. RS-256 for both of those. Go to credentials, grab the new client key, put that there. Come back over here, go to mappers. Create, it'll be a mapper type of audience, include mapper of Nautobot. Mapper, save that. Hopefully that should have changed, but we're going to give that a shot. Save that. Let's see what happens. This in an incognito window in case I got something funny in my cache. What am I missing? Because this worked earlier today. Ah, blessed copy pasta. Copy pasta did it. That's gotta love that. Oh, what happened to my terminal? So what happened here is I was copy pasting. So my first copy paste, I left master there. And then my second one, I didn't change it from the auth URL to the token URL. So even though I had talked through exactly what we needed to do, I disregarded my own instructions and didn't do that. So now let's go ahead and let's run this server. All right, so we're at home. Go to login. It worked that time. So that was it. And let's log out. Let's close our incognito. Let's do a new incognito window. I'm going to go ahead and grab the password. So let's go to nautobot.yt6.com. We'll see that it's going to redirect me to my login. Go to admin, specify my password, hit sign in, and we can see now that I'm signed in as the admin user that's coming from Keycloak. Now, let's say I needed to do some type of administrative works. So all of my users have edit permissions and delete permissions through mappings inside of the backend, but no one let's say we don't give users directly access to the admin panel or super user permissions. Let's say we have that super user credential through a break glass environment. In a development environment, are you going to have that? Probably not. You're probably going to have access to your local super user account. But the way you would go in as a super user, because if you try and go into login, oh, we actually get to it. That was a little bit of a change. All right, so we should be good. So now we can log in directly with our admin user. And we can go into the admin panel. Another way to get to this is going to the admin panel login. So easy peasy way of getting in and out of Nautobot. We've got our SSO plugin, SSO backend provider set up and configured. We talked about how we can set up a local environment for SSO. No real flaming on my fun little copy pasta that has improper indentation of our let's see, that out. That's all good. I can but we talked through exactly what the process, what the flow is on the SSO, and why this is an interesting scenario when we come to a local environment. Is first the user clicks on the login button. The login button sends a redirect. So Nautobot responds with a redirect to the SSO provider. So the client, which is the user's browser, receives that redirect and then goes to the SSO provider. The SSO provider kicks it back with a response to do authentication. The client authenticates, goes back to the SSO provider. The SSO provider performs the authentication portion and then passes back a redirect with the JAuth token back to the client. Then the client which then uses the redirect URL that the client had passed in its first redirect, and then that gets passed back to Nautobot on the web service backend. The web service backend of Nautobot then itself reaches out to the SSO provider to validate the information that it received in the JAuth token from the client's browser. Once that responds and is good, then your return URL is what loads. So you can see how we have to go back and forth multiple times, and both the client side browser and the backend Nautobot service has to know how to get to the SSO provider, and that SSO provider has to be reachable with the same FQDN from both the client side and the web server side. So since I work in a remote SSH environment, I'm able to do this very easily through sorry, my brain is going numb for a second, but I'm very quickly and easily able to do this with the fact that I have Route 53 set up. If you're using inside the same Docker Compose, you need to either have the traffic go outside of the Docker network and hairpin back in, or set up an entry on your local host environment into Etsy host pointing to it. So there's a couple different ways that you can get around accounting for this flow and accounting for east-west from the services perspective and from client to server, and it be the same resolution. Like I said, my scenario, what I'm using is just the fact that I'm able to use a DNS entry inside of Route 53. If you host your own bind entry, you can use that. Or you can also just make an additional entry into your Etsy host to point to a specific place that matches wherever you're running Nautobot. So very easy, kind of cumbersome to get it set up and going, but once you understand that both the web server and the client browser have to reach the same URL pattern or same FQDN to get to the social authentication platform, you should be good to go. Cool. Surprised it took this long to be able to ramble through on SSO with Nautobot. This has been something that I've done a handful of times. Please feel free to drop things into the comments if you have any additional questions. I'll be pushing this information up in just a little bit. Also do kind of keep in mind that on the social core uh, project inside of the Keycloak backend, let's go to, oh, come on. There are going to be a couple steps that are here. Um, but these steps are not necessarily going to be exactly what you need. So there's a couple things that we do a little bit of out of order. So we have to create our client ID. That's correct. The client secret value does not come up until you specify the access type as confidential. And then the mappers, this is where we deviate just a little bit. And the mappers, we're actually, instead of using this methodology here, this is where we just use, if we come back over to Keycloak, and we go to our client, and we go to mappers, this is where we create our audience type as a mapper. So create mapper type of audience, specify the specific client, and then we're off to the races and able to take advantage of that. So it's not an exact one-for-one in what their documentation is, because their documentation didn't necessarily match up to what I was expecting, and it didn't work when I followed through step by step on their documentation. So I was able to augment it just a little bit with a little bit of Googling, and we're now able to take advantage of it. On that note, it's been a pleasure. If anyone has any future topics that they would love to see, we're looking at probably next week or the week after, I'll be doing a live stream on Nautobot jobs. But if there's any additional topics, please feel free to drop them in the comments.